Hi, I'm Poilok Choi. I'm going to go over the overview and needs analysis of the combat athlete. Mixed martial arts or MMA was called cage fighting in the past. It includes full contact striking, grappling, and submission. A MMA fight can be won by knockout, referee stoppage, or judge decision. Brazilian Jiu Jitsu or BJJ is part of combat martial arts. Utilizes body holds, chokes, and joint locks. So, think about things where people lock an arm or a knee or a leg or a chokehold. These are things that have came to light recently due to the events of what's going on with the police. So these are just things that maybe we have seen that can look brutal like that, and it can also look less brutal. Again, it just think about just like holds, uh, joint locks, and things where your arm or a knee may be sprained or broken, and an opponent has to tap out to get out of that hold. Depending on whether you are competing in an MMA fight or a BJJ match, you can either have rounds lasting 3 to 5 minutes, or a match of jujitsu which lasts 5 to 10 minutes long. With the fights in the UFC, some of the fights can last 25 minutes with 5 5-minute rounds. Equipment for combat sports, traditional MMA fights are fought with 4 ounce gloves. If some of you guys have worn this stuff before, it's like fairly light, so a lot of damage can be done. And with BJJ, they can be performed with a gi or no gi. So in a no gi, they will just wear like a rash guard or like think of like a dry fit type of deal. And with no gi, you can be a little bit more elusive too because there's no gi there, which slows you down a little bit. In terms of movement analysis, we think of striking as like a punch, a kick, or a knee. Um, who I have pictured here is Jalen Turner. He's one of my fighters who I work with. With these two, we actually got the win. I think via knockout for both of those, and I was fortunate enough to be in his training camp for both of those fights. And with takedowns, these are more like wrestling. Think about uh, taking a knee down to get lower level, to grab opponent, to wrestling down to the ground. Here's kind of just two basic positions to start off with in terms of movement analysis for BJJ, or just the grappling position of a fight. We have full guard, which is you are in the bottom position here, and you have kind of you're actually in control here in the bottom. You have your legs are wrapped around your opponent, and you kind of have their hands or wrists. You're trying for that, right? And then in full mount on the bottom picture here, the guy on top, so the guy in the black gi is in full control here. So again, the top picture looking at full guard, where the bottom person's in control, and the full mount is the top person in control here. So before we had full guard and full mount, now we have half guard. Again, the top one, the bottom, or that, in the top picture, the bottom person is in control here. He has only half of the opponent's body in control, which is called half guard. And then in the bottom picture, the top guy is in side control. And again, here, depending on who you talk to or the situation, either person kind of is in kind of control here. So this, what they're wearing here, is what a no-gi competition would look like as well. So again, it's looks like board shorts and a rash guard, right? Here are two of the more of the common chokes here in combat sports. So the top one, you have the guillotine choke. If you can see there, the bottom person is in the full guard position, has their arm and wrist underneath the opponent's neck, looking to choke the opponent out. And then on the bottom picture is rear naked choke. So you are on top of the opponent or behind the opponent. Again, you have not only do you have one arm underneath the opponent's neck, you have your other arm on top to really lock that choke in. And now here in Jiu Jitsu, here's some joint locks here. Top picture is an arm bar. That elbow is really just locked in hyper extension here, right? So the guy in the black gi on the top here is really cranking on that arm, and then the bottom, the person in the black gi is also performing the joint lock, and it's an ankle lock, right? They're just kind of cranking on that ankle into eversion. Looking at more biomechanical analysis and striking, there's a speed component involved in it. There's hip abduction, trunk and hip rotation, grappling. Those bottom positions, we want a lot of mobility in there, and we also want to be able to either flex the hip to get on top, extend the hip to get out of the takedown, and we also need a lot of strength and endurance in the grip for either no gi or gi to either complete a choke or get out of a submission. Yeah, looking at these prominent injuries, they're pretty severe, right? We have a knockout, a pretty big cut on the lip here. So MMA is extremely violent. It's a full contact sport, so it's one of the highest incidences of injuries within a sport. Most of these fights are stopped with a head injury, and then you also have like big cuts or lacerations where a doctor stops the fight as well. So the grappling side of things, there's more sprains and maybe some broken bones here. Some of these are pretty bad as well. If you're looking at the bottom left, that ankle I think is dislocated, right? It looks like a displaced fracture of some sort. So the incidence rate of injuries is 38.6 per 1,000 athletic exposures. More of the common injuries occur to the knee and shoulder. Additionally, during competition, I think elbow injuries were one of the most common in this study. So in terms of injuries during practice, this study looked back at injuries and then kind of found that sprains were the most common type of injuries, followed by contusions. More data on common injury areas. You got hand, fingers, followed by foot, toes, and then the arm, elbow, and knee. Just looking at those things, hopefully the hand and fingers aren't as severe. If you blow out an ankle or a knee, that might be hurt you a little bit, set you back a little bit more. Interesting data with the FMS. So this study, they did the FMS on these athletes, and then they looked back. Even though it's a contact sport, the athletes who scored lower than 14 had an association with more injury versus people who scored higher. I know they use that 14 number for a lot of studies, but this one was done looking back at the study. So again, they tested the athletes on the FMS, and they went back and looked. The people who scored less than 14 were associated with past injuries during the past 12 months. So depending on what type of how long the fight is, there's different energy system used. Obviously, the longer you go into a fight or a match, the aerobic system is going to dominate. Looking at the UFC, an average fight duration lasted just over 10 minutes across all weight classes. Within the UFC, the heavier the athlete, the shorter duration fight. So meaning like the lightweights, featherweights, strawweight type of fighters, those fights tend to last a little bit longer, whereas a middleweight, welterweight, heavyweight, light heavyweight, those fights will be a little bit shorter. Studies on VO2 max were kind of hard to find. There was a big range. Some of the range anywhere between 29.5 to 60.24 in kind of the grappling, wrestling arena. I think with those sports, it's kind of hard to measure, right? Because of wearing the equipment and it's a contact sport. So it was kind of hard to find some data on some of these athletes. With testing for aerobic capacity, I think I like the yo-yo intermittent recovery test. Because there's a stop and go nature of these sports, I think it's very applicable. Within these numbers, you can kind of find percentile ranks based on age and gender to kind of see where you have to get some kind of standardized norms for each athlete. Power, upper body power, sit up and throw can kind of just measure that core upper body, linking that. I like the broad jump only because I think it's a simpler field test than looking for like a Vertec or some kind of jump mat. And I think the way they land in that deep hip flexion for this, I think it's very applicable to not only the BJJ population, but some of the ranges these fighters can get into. I think it shows some of that. So not only does it measure power, but also measures kind of the end range hip flexion there as well. For move analysis, I know we talked about the FMS scores earlier. I think this is something that can kind of at least give you some insight on movement quality. I know there's also research that says it's not conclusive, but again, looking back at that research, guys who scored less than 14 had more injuries in the past 12 months than guys who scored higher than 14. Some of the more traditional tests can be used for upper and lower body strength, like the one rep max bench press. We have one rep max trap bar deadlift for lower body, and then I like the bench pull a little better. So it's a picture that's pictured there. It's a very static position where you can't really use like the stretch shortening cycle to start the pulls. I think this static position may mimic what closely to what they do in grappling. I thought this was funny since we talked about the bench press earlier. For all of us, bench is a verb, so it's an action that we do. We're going to bench today. But if you say that to anybody else in the world, it's a noun. So I always just thought it was funny that bench is a verb to us and bench is a noun to everyone else. So I think body comp is actually really important for these guys as well, right? If we're trying to cut weight and we have a ton of muscle already, you may be harder to cut weight. So it might be time for a fighter to move a weight class, right? Or they have a lot of body fat, so it is okay for them to kind of cut that weight to go into a weight class. So again, some of these guys might have a lot of muscle for their current weight class, and it may be time to move up. And you also want to be, since it is a weight classification sport, you also want to be at your optimal lean body mass to fight. Don't just make weight and be kind of fat, for example, but we want to make weight and have the appropriate lean body mass for that weight class. Agility test, we got kind of the ball of foot action. You're hopping around in the octagon. This test kind of tests that, right? You're able to hop around, kind of see how fast you complete this test, and it's similar to what these guys do in the octagon, which is weird because I'm using a hexagon test for the octagon. Programming considerations, again, we want to look at the fighting style, so meaning the fighting style of the fighter that you're working with in particular, and the fighting style of the opponent, right? I had a guy, one of my fighters was fighting someone who was I guess also an endurance athlete. So his opponent was like a triathlon athlete. So my fighter wanted to be prepared for that. So during his fight camp for that particular fighter, we just did a little bit more conditioning to kind of maybe if we had to match the endurance of his opponent. And then again, just an individualized program for individualized sports. Some fighters may be very twitchy, or may not have enough endurance, so you want to train those things, or vice versa. Right? So it's based on their strengths and weaknesses, and then their each individual training routine. Some of these guys train multiple times a day, and we on our end have to account for that, right? We have to kind of look at when they're doing their skill work for boxing or striking, when they're doing their work for grappling, and then if they are sparring, how many times are they doing that, right? The last thing we want to do is they just did sparring and then they see us after that, or we got them too tired in our training session because we are training them too hard, right? So These are just kind of things that look at, just kind of their routine or their training routine. Some of these guys, again, they do train a lot, and we want to make sure we are supporting what they do. Different exercises elicit different effects. Some of these ones I kind of just found were more functional or applicable to what they do in a Turkish get up. Again, you can break down the Turkish get up, right? You have half get up variations, you have different holds. We can have it in a front rack position or have the arm extended, locked out for more shoulder stability. So, that's very applicable to someone working on grappling for ground events, right? You got rotational throws, kind of thinking about striking, kicking. I think most med ball throw variations can kind of train that in terms of dynamic correspondence, where we are doing the movements that mimic their sport, but not too much where it has an effect and it hinders their actual technique. So you're doing some of the things, and I like the trap bar deadlift a lot too. I think it does two things, right? You're working on some kind of just being stronger off the ground to generate more force, and I think it's very grip intensive too. So I want to close out with the idea of buckets. A lot of these athletes or these guys, this population will fill a bucket that is already full. They think that they need conditioning and that bucket is full and they want us to do more conditioning. That they may not need that, right? As we know. So we want to make sure that we're filling buckets that aren't already filled. And again, just keeping in mind that professional MMA guys aren't paid like an NFL guy or an NBA guy or even an MLB guy, right? Some of these guys only get paid per fight, and a lot of these times the money is not a lot. So, not, in addition to training and maybe family, some of these guys have regular jobs as well, right? Just kind of keep in mind, I guess, the minimum effective dose for this population as well. I hope you guys kind of got something out of this. You guys have questions, comments, please reach out. I would love to answer them more in detail. Thanks for your time.